Video games are more than just entertainment. The act of play can move us, and it can give us new perspective on the human experience. And games have this power because they're an active medium. Interactivity is what makes a game a game. The Gravity Rush series is a perfect example of a truly underappreciated trend in game design, and it's one that I hope we get to see a lot more of.
She got a big booty, so I call her big booty. Skirt, skirt, wrist moving, cooking, getting to it. I'm in the kitchen, yams everywhere. Just made a jewel, I got bands everywhere.
I'm talking about player disempowerment, of course. Games these days offer players every kind of empowerment fantasy you can ask for. High-tech space marines, swords and sorcery, superhuman soldiers at war, strongman gangsters, the list goes on. But far fewer games have systems and themes built around disempowering the player. Before we go any further, I should define these terms and explain exactly what I mean when I'm talking about player empowerment versus disempowerment in games. Plot and themes are one part of this conversation, but the interactivity of games allows them to create some truly powerful feelings of disempowerment in the player. So, I'm Michael Saber, and this is the Neon Dreamers Grab Bag. The empowered player is tough. It takes a lot to defeat them, so they're allowed to make mistakes. They have lots of tools or weapons at their disposal, giving the player plenty of ways to overcome obstacles. And they're easy to maneuver, meaning the game's controls are quick, responsive, and generally do what you expect them to do. The disempowered player has a relatively weaker constitution, so they're easily defeated. The player can only make a few mistakes. They have limited ways of defending themselves, so sneaking or hiding is often better than fighting. And perhaps most importantly, the controls are difficult or complicated. The control scheme might require complex combinations of buttons, or it might be artificially sluggish, making the player feel like their character has a mind of their own and is never entirely under their control. It's that last part, the controls, that really interests me. Controls are one of the best and most direct ways to create a feeling of disempowerment in the player. But it can be a double-edged sword because it seems like this design decision is very easily misunderstood or despised by the average player.
It still plays like a clunky-ass piece of crap PS2 game. Frustrating shit, but you'll have to deal with some really annoying shit.
For a lot of us, myself included, games can be a way to unwind from the difficulties of reality. We naturally seek out escapism and power fantasies to compensate for how helpless we can feel in the late capitalist hellscape that is life in the 21st century. But disempowerment in games challenges our desire for escapism and asks us to think about why we always want to see ourselves as an ass-kicking Ubermensch. Which is the main reason that Gravity Rush and its sequel became two of my surprise favorites of 2017. The protagonist of the series is Kat, who is basically an anime superhero. The game even makes it explicit by framing its story exposition within comic book panels, directly inspired by the Franco-Belgian bande dessinée style of comics. Our hero Kat can power slide like a Tokyo drifter, unleash high-velocity corkscrew kicks, blast enemies with homing missiles. And she can fly.
That wasn't flying, that was falling with style.
Right. She can't technically fly. She has the power to shift the direction of gravity, which causes her to fall through the air at high speed. So far, this sounds like a pretty standard power trip, right? But the game turns this idea on its head through its controls. There's a ton of inertia to Kat's flying, making the player feel like you're never in complete control, more like you're barely hanging on as you're hurtling through the sky. Her attack animations are fluid, but they also have just enough wind-up that it can be difficult to land attacks sometimes. You'll also spend a lot of time tripping over obstacles, bumping into hapless pedestrians, and running headfirst into street signs and merchant stalls. And Kat's not exactly an ace flyer capable of turning on a dime. It's easy enough to start flying towards the general area where you need to go, but once you start, you can only make slight changes to your heading. You'll spend a lot of time stopping mid-flight in order to fine-tune your course. And when she comes back down to Earth, Kat almost never sticks the landing. So when I started the first Gravity Rush, I did get a little frustrated with the controls initially.
What were they thinking?
But as I played through more of both of these games, I actually started to enjoy this feeling of disempowerment. It's something we just don't get to see in modern game design, outside of the horror genre and a handful of other outliers. It made me interrogate my own feelings of impatience and why I might be so quick to demand instant gratification from games. The series is a unique experience, and by the time I got to the end, I found myself wishing there were more games like them. Even though the Gravity Rush games are bright and colorful and lean hard on their anime aesthetic, they deal with some surprisingly weighty themes. Gravity Rush 2 goes deep on the disempowerment angle. The first 15 minutes of the game are spent clomping around in a bulky mining suit, stripped of your superpowers. And the entire first half of the game's story is about an uprising among the lower social classes of the floating city of Jirga Paralau. The underclass lives in crumbling shacks in the bottom of the city. They are exploited and oppressed by the wealthy citizens who live in palatial estates up above the clouds. As an outcast, a stranger in this strange land, Kat takes up the struggle of the oppressed villagers, fighting back against a shadowy and dictatorial council that has usurped control of the city. In the story of both Gravity Rush games, Kat herself is a blank slate. She's an amnesiac who can't remember her past or how she even got her superpowers. Now, this game trope is massively overused, but it is in keeping with the game's themes of disempowerment. A big part of the game's plot is Kat's struggle to regain her lost identity and reassert her own sense of agency. And these themes are reinforced by the design of the main character. For a game made by a Japanese team, the protagonist isn't exactly a model of East Asian beauty standards. She's loud, clumsy, rebellious, and has dark tanned skin and blonde hair. And just about every other character you meet makes sure to tell you that they don't exactly think Kat is a looker. Kat's character design is based on a Japanese fashion style from the 90s and early 2000s known as ganguro. Ganguro girls wore copious amounts of spray tan, bleached their hair, and caked their faces with colorful makeup. Ganguro was highly popular among Japan's alternative subcultures as a way to rebel against traditional bihaku beauty standards. Disempowerment is even expressed within the original name of the series in Japan, Gravity Days. Besides being a neat double entendre for DAYS days, a daze implies confusion, being overwhelmed or in a sudden state of shock. In the West, this was changed to Gravity Rush, probably to drive home that this is an action game where you get to kick some ass. There are a good number of epic and spectacular moments in both games, but most of your time is going to be spent on small, day-to-day tasks. For every mission where you're battling gigantic shadow monsters, you'll play through 5 others where you're finding a place to live and decorating it, or earning some spare cash by making deliveries, or retrieving missing children. This small-scale focus takes center stage in the Japanese marketing campaign for Gravity Rush 2, which features scenes of everyday life literally being turned upside down. Kat isn't the tropey superhero navigating life in the real world. She's a regular girl who just happens to have superpowers. In that way, she's very much like everyone's favorite beautiful soldier. Down to the comic book color scheme and Black Cat's sidekick. And critically, the character Kat acts with a cheerful and determined sense of agency throughout the story, always carrying herself as though she's in charge of her own destiny, even when she's not always completely confident in herself. In this way, the player's disempowerment through the controls is balanced and given context within the plot and themes. They're part of the growing pains of a young woman finding her way in a confusing world. Now, there are definitely games out there that are great at making disempowerment core to the experience. I think horror games do this really well. Part of what makes the Silent Hill and Resident Evil games compelling is how the controls and systems make the player feel perpetually outmatched by malevolent forces closing in around them. I don't think it's an accident that Resident Evil 7, a game that went to extreme lengths to disempower the player, was one of the most popular and well-received games of 2017. If you'd like to see an excellent in-depth analysis of how RE7 tears you down before building you back up again, check out this video essay by my good friend Ragnarox, link in the description. But I also think that we're long overdue to see more kinds of games start using disempowerment in interesting and unique ways. The sheer repetition and ever more complicated rule set of papers, please helps the player understand how a regular person can become the concentration camp guard at the Nuremberg trials who says, "I was only following orders." Or the way the undead missions in the Warcraft 3 expansion inverted the game's own RPG systems by making your main character weaker as the story progressed. That shit was genius. With the news that Gravity Rush 2 is closing down its online servers, there's been this narrative on forums and social media that the series was somehow a failure, or hasn't lived up to expectations. But I don't think that's fair, or true. The series started as a niche, digital-only title on the PlayStation Vita. Since then, it's grown in popularity by quite a bit, and both games have easily sold more than 1 million copies total across the Vita and PS4. If you get the chance, play these games. As I get older, I find that I'm just less and less interested in games that only care about making the player feel like a badass. It's far more appealing when games suggest the opposite. We are flawed beings with both strengths and weaknesses. We must confront a broken and unfair world and get through it however we can.